Welcome to The Cross and the Medicine Wheel. This is the story of the gospel among the native people of this land, a story which began right here in Virginia 400 years ago and continues to this very day. For centuries, all written history about America began in 1492. In order to understand the perspective of native people, the first thing that must be understood is this. In 1492, the continent of North America was not an empty wilderness waiting to be possessed. It was peopled by more than 500 nations with cultures as varied as European nations from Russia to Portugal. Today, scholars believe that the native population of North America may have been as high as 18 million in the year 1400 AD. Here in the southeast, archaeologists now suggest a pre-contact population of more than 2 million. Nor were these people savages in need of European civilization. Pre-contact Native Americans had political and economic systems as advanced as any on Earth at that time. They also enjoyed remarkable achievements in agriculture, sciences, and the arts. Their achievements compare favorably to those of the most advanced cultures anywhere on Earth at that time. Yet most Americans know little of their accomplishments. Here in the Southeast, we are surrounded by evidence of thriving ancient Native American cultures. Many Americans drive past these archaeological sites every day, but know little of their significance. This map shows the sites of ancient mounds all over the eastern United States, including some here in Virginia. Some of these mounds are small and subtle, while others are hundreds of yards or even miles in length. Effigy mounds, for example, show the silhouettes of animals, but many of these were not discovered until the advent of aerial photography. Here is one such mound in the shape of a serpent near Chillicothe, Ohio. Other mounds are much easier to spot. Some were constructed at the center of thriving cities as large as any on Earth at the time. Here is a sketch of the village surrounding Angel Mounds near modern-day Evansville, Indiana. Visitors can still see the city walls and dwelling places there. The ceremonial center at Moundville, Alabama, has been partially restored today. One of the most impressive of these ancient sites is now known as Poverty Point, Louisiana. At a time when Abraham was still a nomad living in tents, this place was already a thriving metropolis. The city is laid out in the shape of a giant thunderbird, with houses along the circular ridges forming the wings and the sacred mound forming the head. At the heart of the great bird was the plaza and sports arena. This is the oldest planned city on Earth, a masterpiece of civil engineering. Archaeologists estimate that building such a city would require 5 million labor hours, an accomplishment which could never have been achieved by unsophisticated savages. A planned city of this size implies systems of government, transportation, and commerce, all marks of advanced civilization. Even more amazing, some of the mounds at this site have been dated to 3500 BC. That means that they are older than the pyramids at Giza or even Stonehenge, and this was not a short-term civilization. Poverty Point was still occupied as late as 1200 AD. That's more than 4 millennia of continuous civilization. But as astonishing as all that is, those achievements were soon surpassed by the City of the Sun, Cahokia. This great city lies just outside modern St. Louis on the banks of the Mississippi River. At its zenith in 1400 A.D., it housed some 40,000 souls, making it as large as contemporary London, Paris, and Tokyo combined. In fact, the world would not see a larger city for 400 years. The great mounds in this city were virtually mountains towering over the horizon. Even today, they are the largest pyramid structures on Earth. Yet most Americans know more about the pyramids in Egypt than these in their own land. Many other accomplishments of native people are just as impressive. Consider, for example, these cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde. As early as 950 A.D., these were the first structures on Earth to employ passive solar heating in the winter and cooling in the summer. Native Americans were mining, smelting, and trading copper more than 5,000 years ago, making them among the first metal workers on the planet. Native Americans were also producing fine pottery as much as 8,000 years ago. Indian farmers were also among the most advanced agriculturalists on Earth. More than half of the world's table vegetables were first grown by Native American farmers. Ancient artisans produced statues, carvings, and etchings, which compared favorably with magnificent artworks produced by the greatest civilizations on Earth. Some of them continue to amaze us. These whimsical carvings from Guatemala are called fat boys. At 4 to 6 feet tall, they're pretty hard to miss. Yet it was not discovered until the 1970s that these carvings are magnetic. Every single one of them has a magnetic spot on the right temple. Archaeologists had long believed that these carvings were around 4,000 years old. Until this discovery, it was believed that the ancient Chinese were the first to experiment with magnets. The Fat Boys broke that record by 2,000 years. How could illiterate people have been so advanced? Well, as it happens, the conquistadors discovered libraries full of ancient Native American books and burned them all. This one, known as the Dresden Codex, is considered one of the rarest books in the world. It contains multiplication tables and accurate calculations for the dates of eclipses. Little wonder, then, that ancient native astronomers would calculate the exact positions of the stars, and architects would even build observation towers like this one at Hovenweep, Utah. To this day, these towers still emit shafts of light to announce important solar and celestial events. Native people surveyed more than the heavens. Here is a NASA photograph of Chaco Canyon. The irregular yellow lines are modern highways, but the red lines are ancient highways going arrow straight for miles and miles through the Four Corners region of the United States. These roads are a mystery to this day. They are still visible from space after more than 1,000 years. Native American societies also enjoyed great political achievements. Before the United States Constitution was written, the Founding Fathers learned about the great law of the Iroquois Nation, which included 3 branches of government and a legislature with 2 houses, all with specific duties, as well as checks and balances. Even the Great Seal of the United States borrows from the Iroquois symbols of an eagle clutching a branch of the Tree of Peace and a bundle of arrows, one for each member state, symbolizing strength through unity. Native Americans also had roads and trade routes which spanned the continent. The earliest diaries of the conquistadors bore witness to these well-known highways as they followed roads from one city to the next. So we see that Native American civilizations bore all the great hallmarks of other magnificent civilizations: systems of government, trade, commerce, agriculture, and communication, along with remarkable achievements of mathematics, sciences, and arts. Then how is it that so few Americans know much of this vibrant culture? The answer begins with a staggering loss of life. From 1400 to 1600 AD, native populations in America dropped at an amazing rate. Here in the Southeast, the population fell by 93%, from 2 million to 140,000. Measles, cholera, influenza, and other plagues introduced by explorers swept through the trade routes, destroying entire cities in a matter of days, sometimes just hours. Even livestock carried diseases that might barely sicken Europeans, but among native people were as deadly as the plague. These diseases spread most quickly in the great cities. Europeans, following in the footsteps of the conquistadors just 50 years later, found cities abandoned and great confederacies crumbled. More Native Americans died from diseases or alcohol than all the wars combined. Now, the point of all this is not to seek pity, but to describe the scope of the spiritual crisis which occurred among Native Americans. You see, these people trusted God to provide for their every need. They considered sickness to be a lack of balance, very similar to the Hebrew idea of shalom. But what happens to your faith when you see that a whole group of newcomers are immune to disease, but your walk with God cannot keep you well any longer? You start to believe that God must be favoring these newcomers, and that their religion must have great power. The early Native American converts to Christianity were seeking more than a way of life. They were seeking life itself. As Native Americans died, Europeans arrived to fill the void. At first, this seemed like an ideal arrangement. Europeans brought valuable trading goods. They moved into the same villages and tended the same fields that Indians had previously worked. Sometimes they even moved into the same houses that Indians had recently left empty. But Europeans soon demanded the most productive fields and villages still occupied by their native neighbors. Those who dared to resist these demands were considered hostile and were exterminated. So it was that in the year 1637, less than 30 years after the first European settlers arrived, the Puritans demanded the fertile fields near modern-day Mystic, Connecticut. When the Pequot Indians refused to leave their homes, 250 Puritans set fire to their village by night and burned the occupants alive. Those who attempted to crawl to safety were shot. Eyewitness Cotton Mather, a Puritan minister, said the massacre was a sweet sacrifice, a pleasing aroma to God. He also assured those in the mob who were reluctant to kill children that it was clearly God's will for them to die with their parents. Now, Brother Cotton went on to become the lead prosecutor at the Salem witchcraft trials, and history has not been kind in judging him. However, we must say that his attitude toward native people was normal among European clergy at this time. Catholic scholars were still debating whether the man-like creatures in America could be considered human. Some Christians were shocked at this brutal treatment of native people. Among them was John Wesley, who came to Georgia with a dream of preaching to the Indians. All his life, he called his circuit riders to reach out to Native Americans. In an age where others treated Indians as less than human, Wesley was amazingly open to them as spiritual equals. What was it that Wesley and others saw in the spirituality of America's first people? Well, to begin with, Indians were not wild pagans. Native people already knew and worshipped the great mystery, just as Yahweh was introduced in the Bible. Many important teachings of the Bible were already known by native people as well. For example, Indians of the Southeast maintained cities of refuge and forgave all debts at a time of Jubilee, just as God commanded in the Old Testament. Native people already knew how the Spirit brought new life, and they knew that the gift of the Creator's blood brought salvation. When they heard of Christianity, they accepted the gospel as a new way of describing the God they already knew. When the behavior of missionaries matched their message, Christian missions were very well received by most native communities. But the more successful a mission was, the less time it was allowed to exist. Why? Well, on the American frontier, a successful mission was the first step toward a permanent European settlement. Christian Indians were considered more civilized, that is, ready to receive a new treaty and be moved to a new reservation. Sometimes missionaries protested this movement. A few were even jailed for their efforts. But try as they might, none were able to slow the push of the immigrants. Many missionaries were more than willing participants in this tide, however. Since Indians were not allowed to hold deed to land, the first white man on the scene, often the local missionary, held the deeds for them. When the Indians were moved out, the deed holders became very wealthy in the process. So missionaries watched out for souls and for prime real estate. The speed of this removal is difficult to imagine. This was Indian territory in 1775, on the eve of the American Revolution. The green area was controlled by France, and the yellow areas were claimed by Spain, but these two powers never wanted to rule over native people. They just wanted to control the trade from those areas. The white area had not been explored. No one knew what was out there. The blue area was claimed by England, but there were still more Indians than immigrants there, and they still thought the land was theirs. Just 30 years later, Indian-controlled lands were reduced to this. After another 40 years, this was all that was left of Indian territory. After another 20 years, it was reduced to this, and 15 years later, it was reduced to this. We can scarcely imagine the devastation caused by this massive removal. Native people take their very identity from the land. In most native tongues, we call ourselves the people of the North Woods, or the people of the mountains, or the people of the lakes, or simply the real people of this land. We believe the land reveals God's purpose to us and keeps us in balance with God's plan. When we are removed from that land, who are we? To this day, many native people are still struggling to find our existence apart from the land. Sometimes Christians have helped in that struggle. The Methodist Church was one of the first to ordain native preachers, Nor did Methodists require Indians to give up traditional languages or medicine in order to be Christians. Instead, Methodists built schools, translated scriptures, and lived among native people. There are many bright sides to the relationship between Indians and the people called Methodists. But there were dark sides as well. This is Black Kettle, a Cheyenne peace chief. As trains and cities spread across the plains, he realized the old ways were gone forever. So he devoted his life to making peace instead of conflict. With the buffalo gone and all his warriors dead, his people were near starvation, and winter was coming on. He led a band of 200 unarmed souls, mostly women, children, and elders, to Fort Lyon, Colorado, at the invitation of the governor. He came under a U.S. flag bearing letters of commendation from President Lincoln. No one in that camp had any idea they were about to be a part of one of the worst massacres in U.S. history. On November 29th, Colonel John Chivington led a band of vigilantes attacking Sand Creek before dawn and slaughtering every living soul. When some of his men hesitated to kill children, Chivington urged them on, saying, "Nits make lice." His mob then butchered the bodies of the dead and dying to make human tobacco pouches and hatband souvenirs. At the time of this mass murder, John Chivington was a Methodist minister. In fact, he had been the superintendent of the Rocky Mountain District. Prior to that, incredibly, he had been a missionary to the Wyandot Indians. Chivington's commanding officers were furious, not because he had killed unarmed Indians, but because he had raised his own band of vigilantes to do the deed. As reports of the atrocities came out from Sand Creek, even battle-hardened veterans were sickened. His superior officer called Chivington an inhuman monster, and the massacre of Sand Creek marked a change in American public opinion regarding the plight of the Indians. But no charges were ever filed against Chivington, and in some quarters he remains a hero to this day. Now, these extremes of grace and gore were not unique to Methodism. Every organized arm of the church had similar tales of honor and shame. As the 19th century drew to a close, the bloodshed slowed. Still, people were not sure how to deal with the Indian problem. Christian boarding schools sought to destroy the savage in order to save their souls. Many of the teachers at Indian boarding schools gained the experience necessary to teach Indian children in the military or state penal institutions. Native children who spoke their own language were punished with days of solitary confinement. Across America, well-meaning Christians established hundreds of Indian mission boards. These programs would flourish for a few years, then closed down as denominational leaders decided it would be best for Indians to learn to blend in. These images from the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania give some idea of the cost of blending in. Here in Virginia, under the leadership of Dr. Walter Plucker, the Commonwealth's first director of vital records, the state ruled that Indians were an impure mongrel race, unfit for education or basic human rights. Plecker destroyed the birth, marriage, and death records of all Indian people. Virginia even passed a law which made it a felony to claim to be an Indian within the Commonwealth. To this day, Native people call this the time of paper genocide. Plecker's views on racial superiority, forced sterilizations, survival of the fittest, and selective breeding were not considered unusual at that time. Leading scientists thought it was all part of evolution. The Carnegie Institution and Rockefeller Foundation both funded racial superiority research. One leader especially welcomed their support. His name was Adolf Hitler. It was Hitler who openly admired American eugenics as a scientific plan for progress that he called termination, his solution to the Jewish problem. Many Native Americans fought and died to defeat Hitler's plan. Only recently have we begun to learn how much the world owes the Code Talkers and other Native American veterans. But when those veterans came home, the Truman administration adopted an official policy of termination to solve the Indian problem. Truman instructed Bureau of Indian Affairs Director D.S. Meyer to get Indians to move away from tribal areas. His goal was to close down all Indian reservations. From 1952 to 1972, the federal government moved more than 100,000 Indians into urban areas. Termination was proceeding on schedule. Today, more than 60% of all Native Americans live in cities and suburbs. In these urban settings, Native Americans became an invisible minority. Mission workers turned their attention to more visible problems. The vast majority of Indian people today have no home, no land to call their own, and no traditions to support them. In the 1960s, something significant began to change. Up until this time, Native missions had not included the opinions of Native people in their plans. The United Methodist Church became the first to make Native Americans the leaders of their own missions. Members of the Oklahoma Indian Mission Conference won the right to vote at General Conference. This led to more changes. In 1984, the southeastern jurisdiction of the United Methodist Church created an agency, Sejanam, to oversee the work among Native people. In 1988, the Oklahoma Indian Mission Conference won the right to ordain pastors and established missions beyond its borders. This brought bold new plans for evangelism and leadership development. Still, progress was slow. Why? Lack of funds was a major problem. After 400 years, Native people are still the poorest minority in America. Those who wanted to become pastors could not afford to go to school. Those who wanted to build churches had no means to do so. John Wesley's dream of reaching Native Americans still needed resources to make it a reality. That's why the General Conference of 1988 also authorized Native American Ministry Sunday. This offering helps to support existing Native American ministries, fund new missions to Native people, and educate Native American pastors. These efforts hold tremendous promise, but much work remains to be done. Many Christians are still unaware of the needs of Native Americans. Here in Virginia, only one congregation in 10 observes Native American Ministry Sunday. Why should we, they say? There are no Indians around here. Yet Virginia has 8 recognized tribes and 2 reservations within her borders. Native Americans live in every city and county of this Commonwealth. More than 35,000 Virginians claim Indian heritage today, but the Virginia Conference boasts only one traditional Native American church. Today, the number of Native Americans who worship there is 0. What will the 21st century bring? Will this be the time that those ministries to Native people finally blossom and grow? Or will all those good intentions still be unfulfilled? The answer is up to you. With your help, John Wesley's dream can finally be fulfilled. Let the dream begin today.